The morning frost clung to the fence posts like sugar dust, and Martha Bennett pulled her father's old coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out onto the porch. The Montana sky stretched endless and pale above the valley, promising another cold day before winter truly set its teeth into the land. She'd been up since before dawn, as was her way these past 3 years since Pa died and left her the ranch. The coffee was bitter and black in her tin cup, steam rising like prayers in the crisp air. Below the porch, 60 head of cattle moved slow through the pasture, their breath making small clouds. They were good stock, hardy enough for these mountains, though she'd lost 2 calves to wolves last month. That was the way of things out here. The land gave and the land took, and you learned to live with both hands of fate. Martha set down her cup and walked to the barn, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. The milk cow, Bessie, lowed soft in greeting. Martha ran her hand along the animal's warm flank before settling on the 3-legged stool, her fingers working practiced and sure. The milk rang against the bottom of the pail, a rhythm as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Just you and me again today, old girl," she murmured. Bessie's tail swished in response. At 32, Martha had outlived most folks' expectations for a woman alone on the frontier. The neighboring ranchers, the Carsons to the east, the Hendricks clan to the south, they all figured she'd sell after Pa died. Walter Hendricks himself had made 3 offers, each one more insistent than the last. But this land was Bennett land, broken by her father's hands, and she'd be buried in it before she'd sell. After the milking, she checked the fence line along the north pasture. The posts Pa had set 15 years back still stood straight, though she'd had to replace the wire twice. Her hands were rough from the work, nothing like her mother's hands had been, soft and white as church gloves. Ma had died birthing Martha's brother, who'd lived just long enough to be named Thomas before following her to the grave. The sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and warming her back as she worked. She found a section where the wire had gone slack and spent an hour tightening it, using Pa's old fence pliers that fit her grip like they'd been waiting for her all along. By noon, she'd moved the cattle to the south pasture, cleaned out the barn, and split enough wood to last 3 days. Her arms ached and her back complained, but it was good. Honest pain, the kind that told you you'd earned your supper and your sleep. She was washing her face at the pump when she saw the riders. 3 of them, coming down from Coulter's Pass, moving fast enough to raise dust. Martha dried her hands on her skirt and walked casual-like to where Pa's Winchester leaned against the porch rail. She didn't pick it up, just stood near enough to reach it quick if needed. But as they got closer, she recognized Tom Carson's bay mare and relaxed some. Tom pulled up at the gate, tipping his hat. His boy Samuel was with him, and Fred Olson from town. "Afternoon, Martha," Tom said. His face was grim under the dust. "Hate to trouble you, but thought you should know. The Garrett place got hit 2 nights back." Martha's stomach tightened. The Garretts ranched 15 miles north. Good people with 3 young ones. Indians. Tom shook his head. "Rustlers. Took 30 head. Killed their dog. Burned the barn. Jim Garrett took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live." "They're saying it's the Coulter gang," Fred added, shifting in his saddle. "Same bunch that's been working their way down from Canada." Martha nodded slow, processing this. Rustlers were a different kind of trouble than wolves or weather. "Thanks for the warning. You heading to the other spreads?" "Already been to Hendricks. They're doubling their night watch." Tom gathered his reins. "You might want to consider staying with someone till this blows over. A woman alone." "I'll manage," Martha said, her voice steady as stone. "Same as always." Tom looked like he wanted to argue, but 30-odd years in cattle country had taught him when a conversation was done. He touched his hat again and the 3 men rode on. Martha watched them go, then walked into the house and loaded both the Winchester and Pa's old Colt revolver. She set them where she could reach them quick, the rifle by the door, the pistol on the kitchen table. Then she went about her afternoon chore same as any other day, though her ears stayed sharp for sounds that didn't belong. Come evening, she cooked her usual supper beans and salt pork, cornbread from yesterday. She ate at the table facing the window, watching the sun paint the mountains gold, then purple, then black. The autumn nights came early now, and cold. She'd need to bring the horses closer to the barn soon, maybe move some of the cattle too. After supper, she sat by the stove with her mending basket. The work lamp cast a yellow circle of light around her chair, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. Her needle moved steady through a torn shirt sleeve, making tiny stitches her mother would have been proud of. Outside, a coyote called from the ridge, answered by another further off. Normal sounds, safe sounds. She thought about the Garretts, about Jim bleeding and their barn in flames. In her mind, she walked through what she'd do if riders came in the night. The Winchester held 15 rounds, the Colt 6. There were extra cartridges in the drawer, the kitchen door could be barred, and the root cellar had a hidden entrance if things went bad. But thinking about it and living through it were different creatures entirely. She'd killed her share of rattlesnakes and put down a horse with a broken leg, but she'd never shot at a man, never had to find out if she could. The knock on her door came just as she was banking the stove for the night. 3 solid raps, not aggressive but not timid either. Martha stood still, her hand moving to the Colt on the table. "Who's there?" "Name's Elijah Stone. Ma'am, don't mean to trouble you." The voice was deep, steady, unfamiliar. Martha picked up the pistol, holding it low but ready. "State your business, Mr. Stone." "Passing through to Willow Creek. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. Saw your light. Hoped I might shelter in your barn till morning. I can pay." Martha moved to the window, peering out careful. In the moonlight, she could make out a tall figure holding the reins of a limping horse. He stood easy, hands visible, making no move toward the house. "You alone?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied what she could see of him. Big man, broad through the shoulders. Could be trouble, could be telling true, but a man meaning harm probably wouldn't knock and ask permission. "Barn's open," she called through the door. "There's hay in the loft and water in the trough. You touch anything else, I'll know it." "Obliged, ma'am. I'll be gone at first light." She watched from the window as he led his horse to the barn, moving slow and steady, favoring the animal's hurt foot. He disappeared inside and she saw the faint glow of a lantern. Then nothing. Martha sat in Pa's chair by the window that night, the Winchester across her lap and the Colt on the armrest. She dozed some, but never deep, starting awake at every small sound. The barn stayed dark and quiet. Just before dawn, she heard movement, the stranger saddling his horse, talking low to the animal. She was on the porch when he emerged, standing so he could see the rifle in her hands. In the gray morning light, she got her first real look at him. Weathered face, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of stillness that comes from living alone in wild places. His clothes were worn but clean, his gun belt well-oiled. When he saw her, he stopped and touched his hat brim. "Morning, ma'am. Grateful for the shelter." He reached slow into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. Setting it on the fence post, Martha didn't move to take it. "That's not necessary." "Maybe not, but it's right." He swung up onto his horse, the new shoe Fred Olson must have put on yesterday glinting dull in the dawn light. "You might want to move your stock closer to the house." Signs of riders in the hills who weren't particular about keeping to the trails. Before she could respond, he'd turned his horse and was heading west, not hurrying but not lingering either. Martha watched until he disappeared over the rise, then walked to the fence post and picked up the silver dollar. It was warm from his pocket, and heavier than she expected. The trip to Morrison's trading post took half a day when the roads were good. Longer when autumn rains turned the trails to mud. Martha needed supplies before winter set in proper salt. Flour, ammunition, and new leather for mending harnesses. She'd hitched the wagon early. leaving the ranch under a sky that promised rain by evening. Morrison's sat at the crossroads where the mountain trail met the valley road, a low-slung building of logs and tar paper that served as store, saloon, and social hall for every ranch within 30 miles. Martha tied her team to the post and climbed down, her boots hitting the packed dirt with a solid thud. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of pickle brine from the barrel by the counter. Jake Morrison looked up from his ledger, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Martha Bennett, been wondering when you'd make it down." "Need to stock up before the snow flies," she said, pulling her list from her pocket. "And I'll take whatever news comes free with the flour." Jake chuckled, already reaching for the items she needed. "Well, the Hendricks boy got himself engaged to that school teacher from Billings. Tom Carson's mare foaled twins, both healthy. And there's been a stranger asking about land up in the hills." Martha looked up from examining a bolt of cloth. "What kind of stranger?" "Mountain man. From what I hear, goes by Elijah Stone. Bought supplies here last week, paid in gold coin." Jake lowered his voice. "Sam Hendricks saw him up near Eagle's Rest, building what looked like a cabin foundation." The name stopped Martha cold. The same man who'd sheltered in her barn 3 weeks back. She kept her face neutral, continuing to inspect the cloth. "Eagle's Rest is rough country, no good for cattle." "That's what I told him when he asked about it. Man just nodded and bought 100 pounds of nails." Jake started tallying her purchases. "Strange fellow. Polite enough. But there's something about him makes folks step careful." The door opened with a creak, and Martha turned to see the very man they'd been discussing. Elijah Stone filled the doorframe, having to duck slightly to enter. His eyes found hers immediately, and he touched his hat brim in recognition. He looked the same as that morning at her ranch-worn clothes, careful movements, that stillness that seemed to take up more space than his body did. "Ma'am," he said, then nodded to Jake. "Morrison." "Stone." Jake's manner shifted, becoming professionally neutral. "What can I do for you?" "Need another sack of coffee and some rope if you've got it." While Jake fetched the items, Elijah moved to examine the shelf of ammunition, keeping a respectful distance from where Martha stood. She found herself studying him sidelong, the scarred knuckles that spoke of old fights, the way he favored his left leg slightly, how his coat hung loose enough to hide a shoulder holster. "Building a place up at Eagle's Rest," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. He turned to look at her full on, and she was struck again by his eyes gray as winter sky, holding depth she couldn't read. "I am good water up there, southern exposure. Man could make something of it. If the winters don't kill him first." A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I've wintered in worse places." Jake returned with the rope and coffee, clearly eager to complete the transaction and have Stone on his way. As Elijah counted out payment, Martha noticed his hands strong, capable, but gentle in their movements. Hands that could break things or build them with equal skill. He was nearly to the door when he turned back to her. "Your ranch you ever need an extra hand for heavy work. I'm 2 hours north. Trail starts at the lightning-struck pine." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. Jake let out a breath he'd been holding. "That man makes me nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs," he muttered. Martha gathered her purchases, her mind turning over the encounter. "He seemed dangerous to you." "Not dangerous exactly, just—" Jake searched for words. "Like he's waiting for something, or running from something. Maybe both." Outside, Martha loaded her wagon while watching Elijah Stone ride north on his horse, a pack mule trailing behind. When he reached the bend in the trail, he stopped and looked back. Even at that distance, she felt the weight of his gaze. Then he touched his hat and disappeared into the trees. The ride home was quiet, except for the creak of wagon wheels and the distant rumble of thunder. Martha's thoughts kept returning to those gray eyes and scarred hands, to the way he'd said man could make something of it, like he was talking about more than just land. She was still a mile from home when she saw the smoke. Not the white smoke of a chimney, but black, oily smoke that meant something wrong. Martha stood up in the wagon, her heart hammering as she urged the horses to a run. The wagon bounced and rattled over the rough trail, supplies sliding in the bed behind her. But as she crested the last hill, she saw her buildings intact. The smoke was coming from further south the Hendricks place. She could see riders heading that way, and without thinking, she turned her team to follow. The Hendricks hay barn was fully ablaze when she arrived, flames reaching 50 feet into the sky. Men had formed a bucket line from the well, but it was hopeless. The structure was already collapsing in on itself. Martha jumped down from her wagon and ran to where Walter Hendricks stood watching his winter feed turn to ash. "What happened?" "Started about an hour ago," Walter said, his face grim. "No one saw anything, just sudden like the whole thing went up." He spat tobacco juice. "That's $3,000 of hay gone." "Could be worse," his wife Helen said, clutching their youngest boy. "Could have been the house, could have been the stock." Martha helped with the bucket line until it became clear they were only keeping the fire from spreading, not saving anything. As the sun set, the barn collapsed entirely, sending up a shower of sparks that looked like stars against the darkening sky. It was near midnight when she finally headed home, exhausted and reeking of smoke. The moon was high and bright, casting everything in silver. She was thinking about nothing but her bed when she saw him, a figure on horseback, still as a statue on the ridge above her ranch. Elijah Stone. She stopped her wagon, one hand moving to the rifle beside her on the seat. He made no move to approach, just sat there watching. After a long moment, he raised his hand a greeting or farewell. She couldn't tell and turned his horse north toward the mountains. Martha sat there in the moonlight, watching the empty ridge, her heart beating strangely in her chest. She thought about the Hendricks barn, about rustlers in the hills, about a man building a cabin where no sensible person would build one. Most of all, she thought about gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to parts of herself she'd forgotten existed. When she finally moved the wagon forward, she found something on her gatepost, a piece of paper held down by a stone. She unfolded it in the lantern light, finding a few lines written in a careful hand. "Saw riders watching your place earlier. 3 men, heading south after the smoke started. Might want to keep that Winchester handy. Ease." Martha read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She unhitched the horses and brushed them down, checked on the cattle, barred the doors. Inside. She loaded both guns and set them within reach, then sat at her kitchen table with the note spread before her. 3 men heading south after the smoke started. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. She thought about Elijah Stone up on that ridge, watching, not threatening, not approaching, just watching, like a wolf watches over territory it hasn't quite claimed yet. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself touching the note, tracing the letters with one finger. "I can already see our sons in the future," she whispered to the empty kitchen, trying the words out like a new language. They sounded impossible, foolish even, the kind of thing that would make sensible folks laugh. But Martha Bennett hadn't survived 3 years alone by being sensible. She'd survived by reading signs, trusting her instincts, and knowing when the wind was about to change. And sitting there in her kitchen with a stranger's warning in her pocket and his presence lingering like smoke in her mind. She felt that wind beginning to shift. Outside, a wolf howled from the direction of Eagle's Rest, long and lonely in the night. Another answered from closer by, then another, until the mountains rang with their chorus. Martha stood and moved to the window, looking north to where a single light flickered in the far distance, a lantern or campfire where no light had been before. She watched it until it died, then went to bed with a pistol under her pillow, and dreams full of gray eyes and scarred hands, and a future she couldn't quite see but felt approaching like winter inevitable, transforming, and fierce. The first gift appeared on a Tuesday morning, left on her porch sometime between midnight and dawn. Martha found it when she went out to start her chores, a small wooden carving of a horse. No bigger than her palm. Worked so fine she could see individual strands in the mane. The wood was smooth as water, polished to a deep honey glow. No note, no sign of who'd left it, though she knew without question whose hands had shaped it. She set it on the kitchen windowsill where morning light could find it, telling herself she'd return it next time she saw Elijah Stone. But days passed, and the horse remained, catching her eye whenever she worked at the sink, making her pause with her hands in dishwater to study the careful details, the arch of neck, the suggestion of movement, even in stillness. 3 days later, she woke to find her broken gate hinge replaced, the one she'd been meaning to fix for months, making do with wire and cursing every time she had to drag it open. Now it swung smooth and silent on new iron hinges, stronger than what had been there before. She stood there in her nightdress and shawl, studying the work. Professional, precise, done by someone who knew their way around both metal and wood. The third gift was different. She'd been out checking the fence line along the creek, gone longer than planned after finding a calf tangled in blackberry vines. By the time she freed it and treated its cuts, the sun was setting. She came home tired and scratched, her dress torn, her mood foul, to find her wood pile restocked. A week's worth of splitting, at least. The logs stacked neat as you please, kindling sorted by size. This time there was evidence wood chips fresh on the ground, the lingering scent of pipe tobacco she recognized from Morrison's store. And on the chopping block, weighing down another carved figure, was a note. Saw you ride out this morning. Figured you had enough work without coming home to more E.S. The carving was a wolf this time, captured mid-howl, so real she could almost hear its voice. She carried both note and wolf inside, setting the wolf beside the horse, tucking the note into her Bible where she kept important papers, the deed to the ranch, her parents' marriage certificate, things that mattered. Martha knew she should be afraid, or at least concerned. A man watching her ranch, coming and going while she was away, leaving gifts like some courting boy. But courting boys left flowers and sweet words. Elijah Stone left practical things, necessary things, and creatures carved from wood that seemed more alive than some breathing animals she'd known. A week passed quiet, then another. The gifts stopped coming, and Martha found herself looking for them, disappointed by empty mornings. She caught herself pausing at that lightning-struck pine he'd mentioned, the trail to Eagle's Rest barely visible through the undergrowth. Once, she rode half a mile up it before turning back, calling herself 7 kinds of fool. Sam Hendricks stopped by on a Thursday, ostensibly to return a hammer he'd borrowed, but really to court her, as he'd been trying to do for 2 years now. He was a good man, Sam, steady, reliable, with his own land and prospects, the kind of man a woman alone should want. He sat at her kitchen table, hat in his hands, talking about wheat prices while his eyes kept drifting to the carvings on her windowsill. "Those are fine work," he said finally. "Where'd you get them?" "They were gifts," Martha said, offering nothing more. Sam's jaw tightened. "From that mountain man, Stone, he's been seen around your place." "Has he now?" "Martha, folks are talking. A woman alone, a stranger coming and going. It doesn't look right." She set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "Since when have I cared what looks right to folks?" "Since never, I suppose." Sam stood, settling his hat on his head. "But Martha, what do you really know about him? Could be wanted, could be dangerous." "Could be," she agreed. "Or could be he's just a man who knows how to fix a gate and split wood proper." Sam left soon after, his shoulders stiff with hurt pride. Martha watched him go without regret. He was a good man, but he'd never understand why she preferred solitude to safety, why she'd rather sleep with a gun under her pillow than a husband beside her who'd dim her spirit with his need to protect what he couldn't understand. That night, she dreamed of wolves, They came down from the mountains in a long gray line, circling her house, their eyes like yellow moons. In the dream, she wasn't afraid. She stood on her porch and watched them pace, and when the largest wolf, silver-backed, scarred across one eye, approached her steps, she held out her hand. The wolf pressed its great head into her palm, and she felt the wild heat of it, the pulse of life that wouldn't be tamed. She woke to find her window frosted over and her breath visible in the cold room. Winter was coming faster than expected. She'd need to move the cattle soon, bring in more wood, check the barn roof for weak spots, 100 tasks that would be easier with help, though she'd die before asking for it. But when she went out that morning, she found fresh tracks in the frost, boot prints, leading from the barn to the woodshed to the well. Her water barrel, which had been nearly empty, was full. The loose board on the barn she'd noticed yesterday was nailed tight, and on her porch rail, frosted with ice crystals that made it sparkle like something magical, sat another carving. This one was different from the others. It was a woman, tiny and perfect, standing with her face tilted toward an unseen sky, her hair flowing back like she was walking into wind. The detail was extraordinary, the fold of her dress, the strength in her stance, the suggestion of a smile on lips no bigger than a grain of wheat. But it was the base that stopped Martha's breath. The woman stood on a miniature landscape mountains, trees, a tiny cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, and carved in letters so small she had to squint to read them, "The Future." Martha stood there holding that carving until her fingers went numb with cold. Then she went inside, put on her father's old coat, saddled her horse, and rode north toward the lightning-struck pine. The trail was rough, barely wide enough for a horse in places, climbing steep through pine and aspen that filtered the morning sun into moving patterns. She could see why he'd chosen this place. It was defensible, hidden, with clear views of the approaches. A careful man's choice, or a hunted one's. She smelled wood smoke before she saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing where the mountain leveled briefly before climbing again, a solid structure of fitted logs, chinked tight against weather. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and she could see a corral with 2 horses, a lean-to for wood storage, the beginnings of what might be a barn. Elijah Stone stood in the doorway before she'd even dismounted, like he'd been waiting. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He wore no coat despite the cold, his shirt sleeves rolled up, wood shavings on his arms. Behind him, she glimpsed the interior of the cabin, neat, sparse, but somehow warm. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some." She dismounted, tying her horse to the porch rail he'd built. "Mr. Stone, seems you've been busy." "Winter comes fast up here. Best to be ready." She followed him inside, noting the rifle by the door, the pistol on the table, the way the windows were placed to cover all approaches, but also the shelf of books, the half-finished carving on the workbench, the quilt on the narrow bed that looked hand-stitched and well-loved. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed her one. It was strong enough to float a horseshoe, but good. They stood there, not quite looking at each other, the silence stretching like taffy. "Why?" she asked finally. He knew what she meant. Why the gifts, the watching, the help she hadn't asked for? He set down his cup, walked to the window that looked out over the valley. Far below, she could see her ranch, tiny as a child's toy. "Had a wife once," he said. "Good woman, strong. We had a place in Colorado, nothing fancy but ours. The war came. I went. When I came back, the place was burned. Her grave already 3 months old. Fever, the neighbors said. But I knew better. She died of lonely, of trying to hold too much alone." He turned to look at her then, those gray eyes holding ghosts she recognized. "I watch your place because I see her in how you move through your days. Stubborn, proud, working yourself into the ground before you'd ask for help. I help because..." He paused, searching for words. Because I can't help her anymore. And maybe because I'm selfish enough to want to matter to something again, even if it's just a gate hinge or a pile of wood. Martha set down her coffee and walked to where he stood. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the scar that ran through his left eyebrow, the careful way he held himself, like he was afraid of taking up too much space in the world. And the carvings? A smile touched his mouth. Those are just hope, I suppose. Things I see when I watch the light change over the valley. Dreams an old soldier probably shouldn't dream. You're not that old. Old enough to know better, but not old enough to stop. No, he agreed. Not that old yet. The invitation had been turning over in Martha's mind for 3 days before she finally rode down to Elijah's cabin again. This time, she brought a basket. Fresh bread. Preserves. A portion of the venison stew she'd made too much of, telling herself it was just neighborly courtesy. Nothing more. She found him working on the barn frame, balanced on a beam 15 feet up, fitting joints with the precision of a craftsman. He climbed down when he saw her, moving careful but sure, and she noticed how he favored that left leg more when he thought she wasn't watching. "Brought supper," she said, lifting the basket. "Figured a man building alone might appreciate a hot meal." "Appreciated, but not necessary," he said, though his eyes warmed at the gesture. "I manage well enough." "I'm sure you do." She looked at the barn frame, solid and true against the sky. But managing and living aren't the same thing. They ate at the rough table he'd built on the porch, watching the sun paint the valley gold. The conversation came easier this time. Talk of the coming winter, the price of cattle, the way the creek was running low for this time of year. Safe topics that skirted around the weight building between them like thunderheads. As she prepared to leave, Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. "Been meaning to give you this proper not leave it on your porch like some sneaking coyote." Inside the cloth was a knife, the blade Damascus steel that rippled like water. The handle carved antler fitted perfect to a hand. Her hand, she realized as she held it. The balance was flawless. "It was my father's," he said. "Carried it through the fur trade, through 2 wars. A blade that's meant for protection, for someone who knows the weight of standing alone." "I can't take this," Martha said, though her fingers tightened on the handle. "You will." His voice was quiet but firm. "Because there's trouble coming down from those hills, and we both know it. Because a Winchester's no good in close quarters. And because—" he paused, meeting her eyes. "Because I sleep better knowing you have it." Martha slipped the knife into her belt, the weight of it strange but right. "Then come to supper tomorrow. Proper supper, at a proper table. 6 o'clock. She left before he could refuse, riding home with the knife's weight against her hip and something warm unfurling in her chest that had nothing to do with autumn sunshine. The next evening, she cooked like she hadn't in years. Roast beef with potatoes and carrots from her garden, biscuits light as clouds, apple pie from the last of the fruit she'd preserved. She set the table with her mother's china, the plates she hadn't unwrapped since Pa's funeral, and told herself she wasn't being foolish. Elijah arrived exactly at 6, cleaned up and wearing what must be his best shirt, carrying a bundle of late wildflowers that looked absurd in his large, scarred hands. She took them without comment, putting them in water while he stood awkward in her kitchen. This man who faced bears and winters alone, suddenly uncertain in the presence of china plates. "Sit," she said, "before everything gets cold." They ate in companionable quiet at first, the clink of silverware and crackle of the fire filling the space. Then, gradually, words came. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about learning to track from an old Shawnee scout, about the war and what came after. She told him about her parents, about the ranch's early days, about the winter when she was 12 and they lost half the herd to wolves. "Why stay?" he asked. "After your father passed, you could have sold, gone to town, had an easier life." Martha considered her answer, cutting into the pie. Because easy isn't always right. This land knows me, and I know it. Every rock, every stream, every mood of weather. In town, I'd be Mrs. Someone or other, keeping house and having babies and forgetting who I was before. Here, I'm Martha Bennett. That means something. It does, he agreed, accepting his slice of pie. Though having babies isn't the worst fate. The words hung between them like a challenge. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but didn't look away. Speaking from experience, from hope, he set down his fork, his gray eyes steady on hers. I told you I see things sometimes, glimpses of what might be. When I first saw you that day at Morrison's, before we'd even spoken, I saw it clear as morning. You and me, and boys with your stubborn chin in my careful hands. Saw it so clear it took my breath. Martha's heart was thundering, but she kept her voice level. That's a dangerous thing to say to a woman, Mr. Stone. Elijah, and I know it is. No, I've got no right to say it, no claim to make it true, but I'm not a man who lies, even when the truth makes things complicated. She stood abruptly, began clearing plates with hands that shook slightly. He rose to help, and they worked in silence. The kitchen suddenly too small with both of them in it. When the dishes were stacked by the wash basin, she turned to find him close enough to smell the wood smoke and leather on him. I don't know you, she said. No, he agreed, but you recognize me, same as I recognized you. It was true, and that truth frightened her more than rustlers or wolves ever could. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. I need time. Time you have. I'm not going anywhere. He moved toward the door, then paused. But Martha, Miss Bennett, those riders I mentioned, they're still out there. Watched your place twice this week while you were gone. Whatever time we have or don't have for ourselves, that trouble won't wait. After he left, Martha barred the door and checked the windows, the knife he'd given her heavy on her belt. She thought about riders in the hills, about the Hendricks burned barn, about all the ways a woman alone was vulnerable. Then she thought about gray eyes that saw futures she couldn't imagine, about scarred hands gentle enough to carve tiny, perfect horses, about the way he'd said her name like it was something precious. She went to her father's desk and pulled out paper and ink. If trouble was coming, she'd be ready, but she wouldn't face it alone. Not anymore. The letter was simple. Mr. Stone Elijah, if you're willing. I could use a hand moving the cattle to winter pasture next week. Can't pay much, but meals included. M. Bennett. She'd send it with the Carson boy when he passed tomorrow. It wasn't an answer to his vision of children and futures, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Martha had learned, were sometimes all the hope you needed. That night she cleaned the rifle and loaded extra ammunition, sharpened the new knife until it could split a hair, and made plans for moving the herd. But before she slept, she took down the wooden woman Elijah had carved and studied it in the lamplight, that tiny figure facing into wind, standing on a landscape that included a cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. The future, she whispered to the empty room, and for the first time in 3 years, the word didn't feel like a burden to carry alone. Outside, snow began to fall. The first real snow of winter, covering the valley in white that would hide tracks and muffle sounds. Martha watched it from her window, the knife at her hip, her father's rifle within reach, and felt the strange peace that comes from accepting that some battles you can't fight alone, and that sometimes, just sometimes, you find someone worth fighting beside. In the distance, barely visible through the falling snow, a light flickered on the mountainside where Elijah Stone kept watch. Martha touched the window glass, cold under her fingers, and made her choice. The morning they moved the cattle, the sky hung low and gray as old pewter. Elijah arrived before dawn, leading a spare horse and carrying rope enough for the work ahead. Martha had coffee ready, thick and black, and they drank it standing on the porch, watching their breath mingle in the cold air. Storm coming, he said, studying the clouds building over the northern peaks. 2 days off, maybe 3, Martha agreed. Time enough if we work steady. They didn't speak of the letter she'd sent or his acceptance of it. They moved like they'd been working together for years, Martha cutting out the strays while Elijah guided the main herd toward the lower pasture. The cattle were skittish, sensing the weather change, but between his steady presence and her knowledge of each animal's temperament, they managed. It was late afternoon when Sam Hendricks appeared on the ridge, riding hard. Martha saw Elijah's hand move to his rifle before recognizing the rider. Sam pulled up short when he saw them together, his face darkening. "Martha," he said, pointedly ignoring Elijah, "came to offer help with the herd." "Appreciate it, Sam, but we've got things handled." Sam's jaw worked like he was chewing words too bitter to swallow. That's how it is now. Mister, Stone is helping with the move. That's all that needs saying. Is it? Sam shifted in his saddle, finally looking at Elijah. Folks are talking. Martha, about him? About you. Morrison says he's seen Comanches sign up in the hills. Others say there's deserters from the army holed up somewhere. Either way, it's no time for a woman to be... To be what? Martha's voice could have frozen water. Working her land, accepting help from a neighbor, speaking for herself. That's not what I meant. Then say what you mean plain, or move along. We've got work to finish. Sam looked between them, his boyish face flushed with anger and something else fear. Maybe... Just be careful. Martha, man shows up from nowhere, builds where no one builds, watches places he's got no business watching. That's not neighbor behavior. That's hunter behavior. He wheeled his horse and rode off without waiting for response. Martha watched him go, then turned to find Elijah standing perfectly still, his face unreadable. He's not wrong, Elijah said quietly, about the watching. I know. Doesn't bother you. Martha considered the question, really considered it. My PA used to say there were 2 kinds of watching. There's the kind that makes you feel like prey, and there's the kind that makes you feel seen. You make me feel seen. Elijah Stone, first time in my life. Maybe. Something shifted in his gray eyes, a warmth breaking through like sun between storm clouds. He started to speak, but movement on the far ridge caught his attention. He went still in that particular way she'd noticed, like an animal sensing threat. Get the cattle moving, he said, voice low and urgent. Now. Martha didn't question. They pushed the herd hard toward the gate, Elijah constantly scanning the ridgeline while she worked the stragglers. They'd just gotten the last cow through when 3 riders appeared on the trail strangers, rough-looking men with the kind of studied casualness that meant trouble. Evening, folks, the lead rider called out. Big man, black beard, guns worn low and loose. Nice herd you got there. It serves, Martha said, moving her horse to partially block the gate. Bet it does. This your spread. Ma'am? It is. The man's eyes shifted to Elijah. And you'd be... The help, Elijah said, his voice flat as winter ice. Blackbeard smiled, showing too many teeth. Just the 2 of you working all these cattle must be powerful hard. Maybe you could use more help. Me and the boys. We're looking for work. Not hiring, Martha said. That's a shame. Winter coming on and all. Dangerous time for folks to be alone. Accidents happen. Barns burn. Cattle wander off. His smile widened. Course, if you had protection. Someone watching out for your interests. Like I said, Martha cut him off. Not hiring. The 3 men exchanged looks. Blackbeard shrugged. Well then, we'll be around if you change your mind. Got a camp up in the hills? Real cozy. They rode off slow, making sure to look back several times. Martha waited until they were out of sight before letting out the breath she'd been holding. Those aren't rustlers, Elijah said. That's worse. Protection racket, Martha agreed. Pay up or burn out. They'll be back. I know. They finished securing the gate in silence. both understanding that something had fundamentally changed. This wasn't random trouble anymore. It was targeted, specific, and it would escalate. That evening, Elijah didn't ride back to his cabin. Instead, he set up camp in Martha's barn without asking permission or offering explanation. Martha didn't protest. She brought him blankets and supper, and they ate sitting on hay bales, planning for what was coming. Need to bring the horses closer. Elijah said, "Move anything valuable into the house or root cellar. Water barrels placed strategic in case of fire." "You think they'll move that fast?" "Men like that count on fear doing half their work. When you don't scare easy, they get impatient." He paused, studying her face in the lantern light. "You could leave. Stay with the Carsons until this blows over." "Could you leave?" He almost smiled. "No." "Then you know my answer." They worked through the night, preparing. Elijah showed her firing positions that would cover all approaches, helped her store extra ammunition where it could be reached quick. They filled every bucket and barrel with water, moved the most valuable tack and tools into the house. As dawn approached, exhaustion finally drove them to rest. Martha found Elijah standing watch by the barn door, rifle across his knees. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll take the watch." "In a bit." She sat down beside him on a crate, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. They watched the sun paint the mountains pink and gold, the valley coming alive with bird song. "Why stay?" she asked. "This isn't your fight." "Isn't it?" He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Martha, I've been drifting since the war ended. 12 years of empty days, going through motions, staying alive because dying seemed like too much trouble. Then I saw you that day at Morrison's, and it was like waking up from a long dream, or maybe finally falling into the right one." He reached out, hesitant, and took her hand. His fingers were rough with calluses but gentle in their grip. "This is my fight because you're in it, because those boys I see in the future, they need both their parents alive to raise them proper. Because I'm selfish enough to want the life I glimpsed, and stubborn enough to fight for it." Martha squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. They sat there as the morning warmed around them, hands linked, watching the land they would defend together. "Tell me about them," she said finally. "These sons you see." A real smile crossed his face then, transforming the harsh lines into something younger, almost boyish. 3 of them. Oldest has your way with animals. Gentle hands, but strong will. Middle one's a builder. Sees how things fit together. Youngest is wild as mountain wind, but loyal as sunrise. 3 boys, Martha murmured. This place would never be quiet again. No, Elijah agreed. But it would be full of life and noise and purpose, full of tomorrows worth fighting for. The news came with Tom Carson at midday. The Garrett ranch had been hit again, this time worse. Their barn, tool shed, and half their winter hay gone to flames. Jim Garrett had tried to fight back and taken a beating that left him barely conscious. His wife Sarah was packing their 3 children into a wagon, heading for her sister's place in Billings. Sheriffs forming a posse, Tom said, his weathered face grim. Every able-bodied man in the valley. We ride at sunset, track these bastards to their hole and finish it. Elijah had been reshaping horseshoes at Martha's forge. He set down his hammer. Considering, Sheriff know where they're holed up. Got a fair idea. That old mine shaft near Devil's Creek. Sam Hendricks tracked them part way yesterday before they spotted him. Martha felt something cold settle in her stomach. Tom, you sure that's wise, going after them in the hills? Their territory. Can't let this stand. Martha, today the Garretts, tomorrow could be any of us. Tom's eyes shifted between her and Elijah. Stone, we could use your gun. Heard you know your way around a fight. I'll think on it, Elijah said. After Tom left, Martha found Elijah standing at the barn door, staring north toward the hills. She knew that look, the calculating distance in his eyes, measuring odds and angles like a man who'd survived too many battles to believe in simple victories. "You're going," she said. It wasn't a question. "Someone needs to stay here. Watch the place." "That's not what I said." He turned to her then, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes. "Martha, men like that, I know them. Knew too many in the war. On both sides. They won't stop until someone stops them permanent. But a posse of farmers and ranchers going up against desperate men in fortified positions." He shook his head. "It'll be a slaughter." "Then why go?" "Because if I don't, good men will die trying to protect what's theirs. Because those men have families. Because—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "Because you think you're expendable and they're not," Martha finished. His silence was answer enough. She moved close enough to see the pulse beating in his throat. "Elijah Stone, you listen to me. You are not expendable. Not to me. You go up there. You come back. You hear me." "Martha. No noble sacrifice, no warrior's death. You come back, or I'll ride up to those hills myself and drag you home by your boots." Despite everything, he almost smiled. "You would, wouldn't you?" "Try me." He reached out, touched her cheek with fingers gentle as morning mist. "I'll come back." The posse gathered at Morrison's as the sun touched the western peaks. 15 men, armed with whatever they had: rifles, shotguns. One man with just a Navy Colt that looked older than Moses. Sheriff Wallace, a good man but better suited to breaking up saloon fights than leading military operations, tried to organize them into something resembling order. Elijah sat his horse at the edge of the group, and Martha saw how the other men gave him space, sensing something different about him. He'd changed clothes, dark shirt, dark coat, moving with an economy that spoke of violence held in check. This wasn't the man who carved wooden horses and fixed gates. This was the soldier, the survivor, the man who'd learned terrible lessons and lived to carry them. Sam Hendricks was there too, trying to catch Martha's eye, but she had attention only for Elijah. She'd brought his rifle, cleaned and loaded, extra ammunition in a leather pouch. 60 rounds, she said, handing them up. "Should be enough." "If it's not, ammunition won't be my problem." She grabbed his stirrup. "You remember what I said?" "I remember." He leaned down, voice low enough that only she could hear. "If something happens—" "Nothing happens. You come back, we face whatever comes next together." "That's the only plan I'll accept." Sheriff Wallace called out. "We ride in 5 minutes. Men, anyone having second thoughts, now's the time." Nobody moved. They rode out as darkness fell. 15 men disappearing into the hills like ghosts. Martha stood watching until the last horse vanished, then went inside and loaded every gun in the house. The night stretched endless. She tried to work mending, cleaning, anything to keep her hands busy, but kept finding herself at the window, watching for movement in the darkness. Every sound made her heart race an owl's call. Wind through the barn boards, the creak of settling wood. Near midnight, she heard horses, many horses, moving fast. She grabbed the Winchester and stood ready, but it was Tom Carson's boy riding hard into her yard. Mrs. Bennett Ma sent me. The posse found them, but it went bad, real bad." Martha's world tilted. "Elijah, Mr. Stone." "Don't know if you—" "Ma'am, they brought some men to our place. Wounded. Ma needs help with the doctoring." Martha was already moving, grabbing her medical supplies, the bag she kept for birthing calves and treating cuts. She saddled her horse in record time, following the Carson boy through darkness lit only by a sliver of moon. The Carson ranch was chaos. Lanterns everywhere. Women heating water, men groaning on the kitchen floor and parlor couches. Blood, so much blood. Martha pushed through, looking for gray eyes and scarred hands among the wounded. Helen Carson grabbed her arm. "Thank God. Sarah, help me with the Hendricks boy. He's cut bad." Sam Hendricks lay on the kitchen table, a gash across his ribs that showed white bone. Martha went to work, her hand steady despite her racing heart, cleaning and stitching while Helen held him down. All the while, she listened to the fragments of conversation around her. "Ambush. They knew we were coming." Wallace took a bullet in the shoulder. "That stone fellow. Never seen anything like it. 3 of them dead for sure, maybe 4. She finished with Sam and moved to the next wounded man, then the next. It wasn't until she was bandaging Fred Olson's head that she finally asked, "Where's Elijah Stone?" Fred looked at her with something like awe. "Still up there, last I saw. Him and 2 others, holding the trail so we could get the wounded out. That man, Mrs. Bennett, he moved like death itself, took down 3 before they knew what hit them. He's still there." Sheriff went back with fresh men. They should... The door burst open. Sheriff Wallace stumbled in, supported by 2 men, his shoulder wrapped in bloody cloth. Behind him came others. And then... Elijah, walking on his own. Rifle in one hand, the other pressed to his side where his shirt showed dark with blood. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Martha felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. She pushed through to him, professional hands checking the wound even as her heart screamed. "How bad?" "Bullet went through clean. I've had worse." "Sit down before you fall down." She worked on him in silence, aware of the eyes watching them, the unspoken questions. His blood was warm on her fingers as she cleaned and bandaged, and she could feel him trying not to flinch under her touch. "The others?" she asked quietly. "Dead or scattered. Won't be troubling anyone again." His voice was flat, empty of satisfaction or regret. "Lost 2 men, Jim Patterson and Carl West." Martha knew them both. Good men with families, the cost of standing ground in hard country. She finished the bandaging and looked up to find him watching her with those gray eyes that saw too much. "You came back," she said. "Said I would." Around them, the chaos was settling into exhausted quiet. Women tending wounded men, others making coffee and food. The beginning of the long process of counting costs and binding wounds, both the kind you could see and the kind you couldn't. The days after the fight passed in a blur of tending wounds and burying the dead. Martha spent them between her ranch and the Carson place, helping Helen nurse the injured men. Elijah had returned to his cabin despite her protests, insisting he'd heal better in his own space. She let him go, understanding his need for solitude after violence, but rode up the mountain trail each day with fresh bandages and food. She found him on the 4th day sitting on his porch, carving. The piece of wood in his hands was larger than his usual work, and she could see it taking shape 2 figures, standing close but not quite touching. "How's the side?" she asked, dismounting. "Healing." He set down the carving. "Sam Hendricks. He'll live, be laid up for weeks, but he'll live." She unpacked the supplies she'd brought: bread, soup, clean cloth for bandages. "He asked about you. They all do. You've become something of a legend in the valley." Elijah's jaw tightened. "That's not what I wanted." "I know." She sat beside him on the bench he'd built. "But sometimes we don't get to choose what we become to people. Sometimes we just are what they need us to be." They sat quiet for a while, watching clouds build over the peaks. The first snow had melted, but more was coming. Martha could smell it in the air, feel it in her bones the way Pa had taught her. "I killed 4 men," Elijah said suddenly. 4 men who probably had families, histories, reasons for being what they were. And I felt nothing, no rage, no satisfaction, just necessity. Does that bother you? It should. He picked up the carving again, fingers working the wood like worry stones. What kind of man feels nothing when he takes a life? The kind who's taken too many. The kind who's seen what happens when violence goes unanswered. Martha touched his hand, stilling the knife. The kind who protected 15 good men so they could go home to their families. Is that what I am, a protector? Among other things. He turned to look at her fully. What other things? Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but held his gaze. A man who carves beauty from dead wood, who fixes what's broken without being asked, who sees futures in morning light and isn't afraid to speak them aloud. Martha. No, let me finish. She took a breath, gathering courage she didn't know she had. Sam Hendricks proposed to me yesterday. From his sickbed, if you can believe it. Said nearly dying made him realize he couldn't wait anymore. Elijah went very still. And I told him no. Told him I was already spoken for, even if the speaking hasn't been official yet. She stood, suddenly needing distance. Maybe I was presuming too much. Maybe those visions you have are just mountain dreams. But I need to know, Elijah, are we building something here? Or am I just another broken thing you're fixing before you move on? He stood too, moving closer despite the obvious pain in his side. You're not broken. You're the strongest thing I've ever seen, and I'm not moving on. Then what are we doing? I don't know, he admitted. I know what I see, what I want, but wanting and having are different things. I'm not an easy man. Martha, I have ghosts that visit in the night, silences that last for days, a need for solitude that might make you crazy. And I'm stubborn as a mule, too proud for my own good, and been alone so long I might not know how to be with someone else. We're a pair of fools if we try this. Maybe. He reached out, touched her face like she was something that might disappear. But I'd rather be a fool with you than wise alone. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing. The valley's talking, about us, about you staying in my barn during the trouble, about me riding up here every day. Let them talk. It matters. Elijah, my reputation. Your reputation is that of a woman who holds her land against all comers, who helps her neighbors, who fears nothing and no one. Nothing we do changes that. It might change how they see me. Then they're looking at the wrong things. She opened her eyes to find him closer, close enough to feel his breath on her face. Elijah, tell me to leave, and I will. Tell me to stay away, and I'll respect it. But if you don't... I don't. The kiss was inevitable as sunrise. Soft despite the hard lives they'd lived. Gentle despite the violence they'd both known. Martha felt something crack open inside her chest. A door she'd barred so long she'd forgotten it existed. When they pulled apart, she was shaking. Come to supper tonight, she said. Proper courting, like respectable folks. We're not respectable folks. No, she agreed. But we can pretend for a while. That evening, Elijah arrived at her door cleaned up and carrying wildflowers again, though where he'd found them in near winter was a mystery. They ate the stew she'd made, talking about everything except what hung between them, the future he saw, the choice they were making, the weight of it all. After dinner, they sat by the fire, Martha in her chair, Elijah on the floor beside her, his head resting against her knee. She found her fingers in his hair without planning it, gentle touches that made him close his eyes like a cat being stroked. Tell me about the war, she said. Why? Because it's part of you. Because if we're doing this, I need to know all of you, not just the parts you think I can handle. So he told her about the battles that had no names, just numbers, about boys dying in mud, calling for mothers who'd never come, about the things men did when civilization fell away, and all that remained was survival. He talked until his voice went rough, and Martha listened, her fingers never stopping their gentle motion through his hair. I came out of it broken, he finished. Spent years trying to find something that felt real again. Built a life in Colorado. Thought I'd found it with Mary. Then she died. And I realized I'd just been play acting at living. Went back to drifting, existing but not alive. Until I saw you that day at Morrison's. You were arguing with Jake about the price of flour, hands on your hips, fire in your eyes. And I thought there's something real. There's someone who knows what it costs to stand your ground. Martha's hand stilled. That's why you watched my place. At first, just curious, then concerned you were alone, and those men were already sniffing around. Then, he turned to look up at her. Then I couldn't stop. You became the point my world turned around, even before we'd spoken. That should frighten me. Does it? No, she resumed, stroking his hair. It should, but it doesn't. Maybe because I was doing the same thing. In my way. Watching for you without admitting it. Looking for excuses to ride toward the mountains. Keeping those carvings where I could see them every day. They stayed like that as the fire burned low. Neither willing to break the spell. Finally. Elijah stood, wincing slightly at his wound. I should go. You should. But she stood too, walking him to the door. Elijah. He turned back. Those boys you see are sons? Do they have names? A smile touched his mouth, soft and wondering. The oldest is James, for your father. The middle one is Thomas, for the brother you lost. The youngest, he paused. The youngest is David, for the childhood friend I watched die at Antietam. Martha felt tears prick her eyes. You've thought about this? Every day since I met you. She kissed him then, quick and fierce. Come for breakfast. We'll start planning for winter proper. Together. After he left, Martha stood at her window watching his lantern bob up the mountain trail. The valley was quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't been for weeks. The threat was gone. The dead were buried, and life was moving forward. She touched her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss, and allowed herself to imagine it a future with gray-eyed boys running through these rooms. Elijah's steady presence beside her through seasons and years, the ranch alive with voices and laughter and purpose. It was a dangerous dream for a woman who'd learned not to dream at all. But standing there in her empty house with the winter coming on and a good man's kiss still warm on her mouth, Martha Bennett decided some dangers were worth the taking. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the valley into something from a painting. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in purple and gold. The creek ran full with snowmelt, and the air carried the sweet smell of new grass. Martha stood on her porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the mountains while Elijah worked on the fence they were extending to accommodate the new calves. 6 months had passed since that night by the fire. 6 months of careful courtship that had the whole valley watching and whispering. Elijah had kept his cabin on the mountain but spent most days at the ranch, working alongside her, sharing meals, building something stronger than any fence of partnership. That's the last post, he called out, stepping back to survey their work. The new pasture stretched green and promising, ready for the growing herd. Martha walked down to join him, noting how he no longer favored his left leg, how the haunted look had faded from his eyes. Looks good, strong. It'll hold, he turned to her, and she saw that look in his eyes, the one that still made her heart skip after all these months. Martha, there's something I need to say. Oh. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth with handling. This was my mother's. Carried it through the war. Through everything after. Never thought I'd have cause to bring it out again. Inside was a ring. Simple gold with a small sapphire that caught the morning light like captured sky. Martha's breath caught. I'm not good with pretty words. Elijah continued. Can't promise you an easy life or wealth or any of the things a woman probably dreams about. But I can promise you'll never face another storm alone. Promise these hands will work beside yours until they can't work anymore. Promise that vision I had those boys. This life I'll do everything in my power to make it real. Martha looked from the ring to his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the hope. Elijah Stone, are you proposing to me while covered in fence mud and sweat? He looked down at himself, then back at her with a rueful smile. Appears I am not very romantic, I suppose. No, she agreed, then took the ring from the box, sliding it onto her finger where it fit like it had been waiting for her. It's better. It's real. It's us. He kissed her then, there in the morning sun with the mountains as witness, and Martha felt the last of her walls crumble. When they pulled apart, she saw Tom Carson on the trail, pretending not to have seen them. "We should tell folks proper," she said, "before the gossip gets ahead of us. Morrison's tomorrow. Let everyone know at once. Saves time on the telling." The next day, they rode to the trading post together, Martha wearing her best dress, the sapphire catching light on her finger. The store was busy for a Saturday, seemed like half the valley had found reasons to need supplies. When they walked in together, conversation stopped. Jake Morrison was the first to speak. "Well, I'll be damned. Excuse me. Martha, I mean. Well, congratulations are in order. I suppose—" "They are," Elijah said simply, his hand finding Martha's. "We'll be married come Sunday, if Reverend Mills is available." The place erupted. Women surrounded Martha, examining the ring, asking about plans. Men shook Elijah's hand, some still wary but most accepting. Even Sam Hendricks, still moving stiff from his wounds, offered congratulations that seemed genuine. Helen Carson pulled Martha aside. "You sure about this? He's a good man. Anyone can see that now, but he's got shadows." "We've all got shadows," Martha replied. "His just show more in daylight." Sunday came bright and clear. The small church was packed, everyone curious to see the independent Martha Bennett marry the mysterious mountain man who'd become their unlikely hero. Martha wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, with wildflowers in her hair. Elijah stood at the altar in his best shirt and a new vest, looking uncomfortable with all the eyes on him, but steady as stone when Martha appeared. Reverend Mills kept the ceremony simple, understanding these were people who valued truth over flourish. When he asked if anyone objected, the silence was profound. When Elijah kissed his bride, someone, probably one of the Carson boys, whooped, and then everyone was laughing and clapping. The reception was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard, everyone bringing food to share. As the sun set, someone brought out a fiddle, and dancing began. Martha watched Elijah turn shy when pressed to dance, but he managed a simple waltz, holding her like she was made of spun glass. "Regrets?" she asked as they swayed. "Never." He pulled her closer. "You—" "Only that we waited so long." As the evening wound down and guests began leaving, pressing small gifts into their hands, preserved fruit, hand-sewn linens, practical things for practical people, Martha found herself standing where she'd stood that first morning, looking out over the land. But now Elijah stood beside her, solid and real, his hand in hers. "I can see them," she said suddenly. "What?" "The boys, our sons. I can see them now running through that pasture, learning to ride, helping with the herd." She turned to him. "I couldn't before. Couldn't imagine any future but the one I was living. But now... Now I see what you saw. A full life, a loud life, a life worth every fight we've had to get here." He pulled her close, and she felt him smile against her hair. "Martha Stone," he said, trying out the sound of it. "Has a nice ring." "Better than nice," she corrected. "It sounds like home." That night, in the house that had felt empty for so long, Martha lay beside her husband and listened to the familiar sounds of the ranch wind in the grass, cattle lowing, the creek running strong with spring melt. But now there was also Elijah's breathing, the warmth of another person in what had been solitary space. "Tell me again," she said into the darkness, "about the future." So he did, painting pictures with words of boys growing tall and strong, of the ranch expanding, of grandchildren someday learning these same hills and valleys. He talked until his voice grew soft with sleep, and Martha listened, adding her own details to the dream, teaching them to read with her mother's books, showing them which plants healed and which harmed, passing on the knowledge of the land that ran deeper than words. In the morning, they rose together to face the work. There was always work on a ranch, but now they faced it as one, moving through the chores with an ease that made everything lighter. When Elijah fixed the barn door that had been sticking, Martha brought him water. When Martha struggled with a stubborn calf, Elijah appeared to help without being asked. By afternoon, they were mending fence again, working in companionable silence. Martha looked at her husband, his hat pushed back, concentrating on twisting wire. Completely at ease in this life they were building, and felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd forgotten its name complete. Uncomplicated happiness. "What?" Elijah asked, noticing her stare. "Nothing. Everything." She gestured at the land around them, the mountains rising eternal, the valley green with promise. "Just thinking how a year ago, I was alone here, fighting to hold on. And now you're stuck with a scarred old soldier who talks to horses and sees things that haven't happened yet. And now I have a partner, a husband, a future." She smiled. "Those boys better hurry up. This place needs their noise." Elijah laughed, a sound she was still getting used to, rich and warm as summer thunder. "Give it time, Mrs. Stone. I have a feeling they're already on their way." As if in agreement, a hawk circled overhead, calling out across the valley. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and growing things. Martha and Elijah went back to work, side by side, building something that would last longer than both of them, a legacy of love carved out of wild land, strong enough to weather any storm. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the mountains, and the first drops of spring rain began to fall, blessing the land and all who worked it with hands made strong by hope and hearts made brave by love. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Leave a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Martha and Elijah's journey. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to share more stories from the American frontier with you.